practical application message. Most important thing in a person's life is to know Jesus, to have a personal relationship with Jesus. But what is the second most important thing? That's what I want to talk about today. The second most important thing, in my opinion, is to be as much like Jesus as we can, to see people the same way Jesus saw them, to look at other people and see what he saw. And we're going to see an example of that today in the calling of Matthew. In Matthew chapter 9, we'll be in verses 9 through 13. Read out the NIV. But this is an example, you know, when most people look at this passage of Scripture, they just think it's okay when Jesus called Matthew, you know, no big deal, he called other disciples. But this was an incredible story, and there's so much more to it than him just calling Matthew, because Matthew could have been given the title of the unlikable disciple, because nobody liked that guy. Nobody. Anybody watched the series The Chosen on TV and saw the description of Matthew and saw his part in it? I think that was a pretty accurate role, because they just didn't like him at all, and there's reasons, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Let me read the scripture this morning. Matthew chapter 9, starting with verse 9. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. And while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but the sinners." There's a story I come across about a guy named Matt. It's not the same Matthew in the story, of course, but at the workplace, this Matthew, or this Matt, he was a guy that they said was openly crude. He was openly rude. He made sexual jokes all the time, and he was very much with April, and she was everything that Matthew was not. She was proper, she was moral, she was religious, and April made sure that Matthew knew that he was going to hell. Which Matthew would always say, "I'll see you there, honey." No one wanted to be around either one of them because they were so miserable towards each other. And most people thought that they were both going to be fired pretty soon because there's so much turmoil in the workplace. The comment most often heard was, "If April is anything what a Christian should be, I don't want to have anything to do with Christianity." That's how poorly her testimony came out, or her witness came out. And then early one morning, the phone rang at April's house, and it was Matt, and he wanted to talk to her. April wasn't sure what to say, so she agreed to meet. She was sure that there was some kind of ploy or something going on to get her out of his area. But Matthew had just received word that his mother had terminal cancer, and she was going to die. And April was the only person he could talk with because she somehow knew who God was. Matthew wanted to pray with April for his mother. So April said that at that moment, the scales kind of fell off her eyes, and for months she thought that Matthew had been the curse to make her life miserable. She thought she had to fight him with tooth and nail, but in reality, God had placed Matt in her life so that he could work in his life. And here all along, April, who was supposed to be an instrument of God, was just getting in the way. Anybody identify with that? Amen. It was strange, they said later, it was strange seeing April and Matt get along so well. It was weird seeing them yuck it up. Everyone noticed, we couldn't help it. So you know what everyone was saying around the store? They said only an act of God could make this happen. We're going to look in Matthew chapter 9 for 4 needs that Jesus met in order to draw out the best in Matthew, to draw out the best in people. As I said before, he was one of the most unliked and despised people in the land. On the social scale, tax collectors were at the very bottom. Even prostitutes had a higher social status than tax collectors. They were considered traitors by the Jewish people. And many people wondered, how did a Jewish person even become a tax collector? Well, the deal was, in that day, they needed somebody to collect the taxes, but they needed somehow to get somebody familiar with the people, and so they had an auction. And they would auction off this job or this position of tax collector. And Matthew won the auction in his region. And so it would be predetermined the amount of money that Matthew would need to collect and give to the Roman government, and a certain sum, and anything he collected above that, he could keep. So it was a pretty good deal, but it was rampant with gouging and abuse, and many of the tax collectors become wealthy, some of them super wealthy. And so he was seen by most people, most Jewish people especially, as treasonous, an extortioner, an oppressor. And that's why they were even, if you can imagine this, tax collectors were barred from the synagogue. Now imagine living in this area and being banned from all the churches. You can't come to our church. No, you can't come to our church. That's how bad it was for the tax collectors. That's how much they were hated. They had no real social life other than those that were like them, those that around them that they associated, because nobody else wanted to be with them. But because he had such few friends, he would have to watch his back whenever he walked home at night. And when Jesus met Matthew, he didn't share that perspective about Matthew that everybody else did. He didn't share the perspective of the majority. In fact, Jesus saw characteristics that were altogether likable in Matthew. And he did have some positive qualities. For instance, he had the courage to swim upstream. He obviously possessed some inner strength to be able to go in a different direction than everybody else was going, and he was going in a different direction than everybody else. Some people would say about him he had spunk, he had grit. And this seemed to be a quality that Jesus even admired. He was also decisive. You can't become a tax collector in that day and time without being decisive. He didn't vacillate. He didn't do it to make friends. He was one of those who knew what he wanted and he went after it. He was social in the group that he hung with. He was lonely to the populace, but he did have a group of friends. And he invited them to meet Jesus when Jesus came to his house for dinner. Jesus probably saw that Matthew could be good company. He didn't try to impress people. He wasn't a snob. It was just who he was. You can note this because there's other people in the stories that were more corrupt than Matthew by covering up their unrighteousness with their false righteousness. So Matthew, on the other hand, he was just who he was. And that's it. But let's not be mistaken, Matthew did have needs. In many ways, there are some of the same needs that we all have, and that's what we're going to talk about this morning. And the first need that Jesus saw was that bewildered people need a leader. They need somebody to follow. And so Jesus said to Matthew, "Follow me." And Matthew, he looked him in the eye and saw something there altogether likable, as I said. And so he gave the challenge, "Follow me, leave this group behind, come join my group." And somehow this must appeal to Matthew. Matthew saw something that he thought he needed because the response was immediate and decisive. Why did he leave so quickly? I believe it's because he saw in Jesus the answer to how do I navigate through life? How do I get through life? If this is the guy that has the wisdom to teach me. You know, in the United States Army is one of the most powerful forces in the world. They're the strongest and most trained soldiers in all the world. And each one is an asset in order to gain victory over their enemies. So the training requires strict discipline from day one. When you go into the military, from day one, when you get there, they're barking orders at you, and they're training you to follow orders in the midst of all the confusion, the chaos, and the noise, to follow orders, to follow the leaders. One of the most dangerous places to be on a battlefield is to find yourself in a minefield. The terror, the fear, can you imagine being in a minefield and not knowing your next step, not knowing what to do? How do you navigate a minefield? You step in the wrong direction, you blow up yourself and your friends. So how do you successfully navigate your way through that? Do you try on your own and hope for the best? You step here, you step there? No. What you do is you wait for the experts, the Army engineers, to arrive, and they clear a path through the minefield. So once the path is cleared, you stay on that path that's been cleared, and you follow in the steps of your leader to arrive to safety on the other side. One wrong step, and it's disaster. Well, as Christians, many times our daily lives feel like we're trying to navigate through a minefield. Some mines are hidden while others are out in the open, but these mines are set to trap you into sin, trap you into desperation, trap you into loneliness. The devil's attempting to entice you to try to traverse the minefield on your own. But it's in these moments that we wait for our expert, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, Jesus. We allow him to clear a safe path through the minefield, where we follow his steps, avoiding the mines that could hurt us or hurt others. We stay on a narrow path that leads to safety on the other side, our home with Jesus. And every life is precious to Jesus, and each one can be a fruitful servant if we follow the path that he clears for us. Matthew 7:13 says, enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. And Matthew knew that he lacked direction in his life. Didn't exactly know where to go, but he saw something in Jesus. He recognized that he could lead him, and so he chose to follow him. Matthew had no compass in his life but the bottom line. I mean, that's all he thought about was the bottom line. He needed somebody to follow. He knew that there was more to life than what he was already doing, and which brings us to the second need that Jesus met. The second need that Jesus saw was lonely people need a friend. Now, anybody that's a football fan knows who Jerry Rice is. Others have probably heard his name, but he was a great receiver, played for the 49ers. One of the best receivers that ever played football. And he was an amazing guy. He had a work ethic second to none. An amazing player. And one time he was being interviewed by a reporter, and they asked him, why did you attend such a small, obscure university like Mississippi Valley State University in Benham, Mississippi? And Rice responded, because they were the only ones that came to my house. I got letters from UCLA, I got letters from all the other big schools, I got, flyers, I got invitations to come and visit, I got all this. But one man from this small little university in Mississippi came to my house. And he said, gave us a personal visit, gave us personal attention. And that's why I went to that school. Taking a chance, by the way, with his great talent of never being seen. But he went there because of the personal touch. In the same way, Jesus gives personal attention to people. He gladly went to Matthew's home. He jumps right into his living situation and goes to his house. He's not afraid of Matthew's reputation. He's not afraid of what people will think of him if he's seen with Matthew. So we find that Matthew's throwing his party, and the description is of a long, kind of drawn-out celebratory feast. It's not a small gathering. I mean, it was a party. We don't know the motivations of those who came. Maybe it was Matthew gave them a special deal on their taxes. Maybe they were just other tax collectors. We don't know. But it was a party that was open to anybody that was disenfranchised by the religious establishment, that's for sure. There was one at the party that didn't have an agenda, that wasn't trying to use Matthew, that wasn't trying to get over on Matthew, that wasn't trying to be his friend for any other reason than just to be his friend. Matthew lacked a friend that really liked him. Most people, as I said, they hated Matthew. And those that did like him were probably just as lonely as he was. Jesus had come to reach them, but there was a group that wasn't so happy with his intentions. When we listen to them, we discover that their language is calculated and designed to preserve the old order. There was a word that the Pharisees are doing. It's called triangling. And by avoiding contact directly with Jesus, they were talking to his disciples. And Jesus and his disciples and the Pharisees were this triangle. The purpose of the triangle is to take two of the points and form an alliance against the other corner. The Pharisees, they tried to do this, but Jesus defeats their efforts and speaks directly to them and answers their question. In fact, Pharisee meant as an accusation, Jesus took it as a compliment. Which brings us to the next need. The third need that Jesus saw was an unhealthy people need a doctor. He flowed to those that were hurting, amen? While others were judging, Jesus saw the hurt that was in individuals. So when he sees Matthew, he sees a soul that was sick and dying. He was a soul that needed care. It was an emergency, if you will. Matthew was dying. So Jesus comes to him to invite him to be a disciple. Matthew's soul lacked new life. He was in poor health. He needed the work of God in his life. He needed to be a new creation, and a new creation he became. They said that Matthew, the worst of the bad, became the best of the good, and began with goodwill from Jesus. Nobody else liked Matthew. The Pharisees just couldn't seem to see this. For all their religious devotion, they lacked quality of mercy. The Pharisees were expecting a Messiah who would not only exclude sinners but also crush them. And he came for sinners, which demonstrates the fourth need that Jesus saw was fallen people need mercy. Jesus was determined to deal with the root problem. Jesus sees sin for what it is. He'll not offer or allow excuses about the past, but he will offer himself. Jesus offers himself to Matthew. He invited him to be a student and a disciple. Perhaps even more important, he mercifully offered him companionship. Matthew needed it because Matthew lacked forgiveness, and in Jesus he'd find it. The world offered condemnation, but what he needed was a fresh start. And this was what Jesus was all about. He went looking for people that needed forgiveness. We need to be honest with ourselves for a moment, for when it comes down to it, we're more like the Pharisees than Jesus. I mean, who were these Pharisees? In 1332 BC, Alexander the Great conquered the Middle East, bringing the Greek culture and philosophy to Israel. By 200 BC, Greek philosophy and its worldview called Hellenism were significantly impacting Jewish young men. More and more of them were abandoning the Hebrew faith and embracing the perceived superiority of Greek thought and ways. And this created a crisis in Judaism. And the word of faith and its covenant responsibilities survive in the generations to come, was the question. So the Pharisees were born in a response to this alarming Hellenistic trend. Its twofold purpose was to call young Jewish men back to the tenets of the Hebrew faith and a priest-like lifestyle. And the first Pharisees had their hearts in the right place. They had a passion for evangelism, bringing Jewish young men back to the historical faith as well as bringing Gentiles into Judaism. They prayed dozens of times a day. How many of us do that? They memorized great portions of the Old Testament scriptures. They had a passion to honor God in everything they did and to fulfill all 613 laws in their lives. But as is true with many movements, factions within the Pharisees slowly began to revise their theology, and they hardened their hearts towards those that were dissimilar to them. Even though there were many, there weren't more than 6,000 Pharisees in Jesus' day, there was a considerable theological diversity among them. There was a saying back then among the Jews, whenever 3 Jews get together, there are at least 4 opinions. There were differences between them in the north and the southern Pharisees, and even within the 2 groups there was a great diversity of beliefs and practice. However, when we get to the Pharisees who increasingly stood in opposition to Jesus, we're primarily talking about the southern Pharisees, particularly those in Jerusalem, who aligned themselves with the Sadducees, and together they constructed this Sanhedrin, which would be our Supreme Court, and it ruled over the religious matters and controlled the worship and the ministry of the temple. So by the time of Jesus, some of the Pharisees had taken observant Judaism to a place that didn't honor God, and in much of what they did, collectively they took pride in their impeccable behavior as they saw it. They focused on their idea of what was right and what's law, and anybody that believed different from them was perceived as an outsider. If you didn't agree with them, you were an outsider. And so they gradually evolved in this us against them mentality. So often we're glad when people are saved, as long as they end up being like us and fit into our way of thinking. But how many people actually have a heart, a love for alcoholics, a love for the drug addicts, the prostitutes, the homosexual actives? How many people have a heart for the men who run the strip clubs or who build the abortion clinics? But Jesus loved them. And just like he liked Matthew, he likes some of these people. How much we need to adopt the prayer of Bob Pierce. He was the founder of World Vision. He said, "Let my heart be broken by the things that break the heart of God. Let my heart be broken by the things that break the heart of God." Larry Terhurst won't forget. He was a teacher who taught in the prisons. And he said he'll never forget when he met Alvin C. Haas for the first time in 1991. Now, they didn't call him Alvin, they didn't call him Haas back then. The other inmates in prison named him Bonehead. And immediately Larry felt uncomfortable with his nickname of Bonehead. He was a tall, soft-spoken inmate. And he wouldn't even look at him when he shook his hand. Needless to say, Bonehead, he was bald-headed. He had hair on the sides that went down past his shoulders. Larry felt as if though they were staring at him, and so he tried not to do that. But there was a large tattoo on the top of his bald head. It was the tattoo of Harley-Davidson wings, and it covered his head. And as a teacher, he tried to maintain composure during the stressful times, and he made it through. And the first day of class, and at the end of the period, Bonehead slipped him a note as they were filing out the classroom. Now Larry thought, uh-oh, he's going to tell me in this note that I'm going to be taken out by the other Harley buddies if I don't give him a good grade or something like that. A little later, Larry had a chance to read the note, and it said, it was an odd comment. It said, "Teach." He called him Teach. "Breakfast is an important meal, and if you're not in by then, you're in big trouble. Bonehead, the mountain hippie." So Bonehead completed the series of 6 classes with Larry over the months. He was an excellent student and who seldom spoke. However, he handed Larry a note nearly every day with some little tidbit, anecdote, or otherwise advice for life. He looked forward to receiving them and become a little disappointed whenever he didn't get one. And Bonehead and Larry clicked. Somehow Larry knew that each time he opened his mouth to teach, Bonehead understood him. He silently soaked up everything that he said. They were connected, and at the conclusion of the course, each student received a certificate. Bonehead had completed the course, doing excellent work the entire way through, and Larry was excited to give them a certificate. They were alone when Larry presented his certificate of completion. He shook his hand and briefly told him what a pleasure it was to have him in his class, and he appreciated his hard work, excellent attendance, and superior attitude. And Bonehead's response stayed with Larry. In a soft voice, Bonehead said this: "Thank you, Larry. You're the first teacher in my life that ever told me I did anything right." I'm going to end here a little early in the message, just and say this. We need to work in our hearts to be more like Jesus, to see people. Close the service for me.
We all stand. And can we just raise our hands toward Pastor Jack? And let's just pray. Father God, you know the body from head to toe.